as this conversation is. Um, well, so I guess we're kind of going to stay on topic for just a minute. We will not have lab tomorrow for the following reasons: that it's cold, it's rainy, and that has two effects. One effect is that just bird activity is lower than it would be if it were nicer weather out. Um, I was out at the farm this past weekend, and I was noticing a lot of bird song out because birds are beginning to migrate back through Missouri. And I forgot my power cord at the farm yesterday and had to go out this morning and get it so that I would have enough power to complete lecture today. And there's hardly any bird song going on out there right now. The other thing is with these plasticine models, the colder they are, the harder they are. I think when we were making the models for the first time, I told you about these people that I know who do use clay models to look at cryptic color patterns in rattlesnakes in the desert Southwest. And one of their problems is that as the clay gets hot, it tends to melt. And so they have to actually partially bake their models in order to firm them up a little bit so that they don't just melt into just a pile of uniform clay. So temperature will affect the results somewhat. So we need to wait until it's warmer, but not too warm. Unfortunately, we seem to be in this weekly cycle where like every Wednesday and Thursday the temperature drops. If you look at the long-term forecast, it's supposed to be cold again next Thursday. But then it's supposed to warm up right after that. And so if it looks like it's going to warm up and stay warm, we'll probably deploy them next week, regardless of the weather, as long as it's not going to, crash again. But given that we're going to put them out, it's going to slowly warm up and then get cold again. Probably better to wait at least a week. So no lab tomorrow. And now that concludes our discussion of the weather.
Are we just lighting a flower pot in your door then at some point?
Yeah, I'll be here at 8 in the morning because I have my weekly meeting with Emily about this class in the morning, so you can drop them by anytime. I have a meeting with Emily. I don't think I have any other scheduled meetings, but students are beginning to come by talking about advising for next semester. But yeah, I'll be around in the morning. I'm just not going to plan on being there for lab.
Well, I just have class until like lab time.
That's fine.
So
That's fine. Yeah, just drop it by. If I'm not in there, just slide it under the door. That works. All right. So we've been talking about living in groups and what the advantages are of individuals in living in groups. We've talked about predator swamping, the dilution effect. Another thing that helps in terms of avoiding predation when you live in a group is predator confusion. There are just so many individuals that a predator doesn't know which one to single out. One of the common storylines in nature documentaries is that, if you see a pack of hyenas on the plains of Africa with a herd of wildebeest, the narrator almost always talks about, they're looking for the weakest and the smallest, et cetera, because that's going to be the easiest individual to take down, et cetera. And so if you are a predator and you have a strategy for choosing a prey among a group of prey, that can help you. But once the wildebeest group starts spinning around, it's often difficult to keep track of a single individual. And so here we have, this is prey fish that are being attacked by a variety of marine predators. And in all of these cases, as the number of members of the group goes up, the capture success of the predator goes down, and presumably this is just a result of too many prey confusing the predator and making it harder for the predator to narrow in on any particular prey item. As it turns out, Predators have different modes of predation, and there's the behavioral ecologists oftentimes like dichotomies. And the nice thing about dichotomies is that they simplify things because you're either this or you're that. But oftentimes this dichotomy belies the fact that there's a continuum of behavior, but frequently you can put organisms into two different classes and do that fairly reliably. In this case, you have ambush predators, which are predators that we sometimes refer to them as sit and wait predators. They tend to sit in one spot and they wait for prey to come to them. Horned lizards do this. They will sit at an ant trail. Horned lizards are ant specialists. They specialize in this country on harvester ants in the genus Pogonomyrmex, and they will locate an ant trail and they will just sit there, and as the ants walk back and forth on the ant trail, they'll just stick out their tongue and pick them off as they walk by. Cruising predators in this paper are oftentimes referred to in the literature as active searching predators. These are predators that move around constantly looking for prey, and oftentimes their own movement scares prey out of hiding. And as it turns out, when you look at the effect of group size on capture success here is expressed by attack efficiency, what you find is that ambush predators are less successful at relatively small increases in group size, whereas actively searching predators tend to do better with larger group sizes. You see that there's hardly any decline here, some decline at the beginning, but then success stays relatively high for the rest of it. And that's probably because these particular strategies for hunting prey have evolved, and the mechanism of sensing and tracking prey for an ambush predator is probably going to be very different from those mechanisms for actively searching predators. And as a result, actively searching predators tend to become less confused with increasing group size, whereas ambush predators become confused at relatively small group sizes. So from the standpoint of predation, there is another common aspect that helps you by living in a group. Let's see if I can get this to come up. Why is my video not running? Oh, I have to enable content. I had to do that last time also. So communal defense is when a group of individuals will actually actively defend themselves, and you can do that if you are in a group much better than if you are alone. Have you guys ever seen mobbing behavior of birds? You'll see a hawk that's being chased around by 4 or 5 different little birds. Crows will mob hawks, little passerine birds will mob hawks. Next time you see a hawk flying in a single direction, look at the hawk and see if there is a group of other birds like dive bombing it. This is called mobbing behavior, as if you are a violent mob. And this is one form of communal defense that is engaged in by birds, usually against other bird predators. You will also see this happening in non-avian interactions, but with birds. So when I was an undergraduate, the biology department was in the Miller Science Building at Stephen F. Austin State University. It was a long building, and at one end there was a little patio that had doors coming out of it and doors coming out of it here, but there was also stairwell doors here and here and here and here. And every spring there would be a pair of mockingbirds. I don't know if you're familiar with mockingbirds, but they're a relatively aggressive bird. And there was an oak tree right outside this door, such that if you came out this door or this door during breeding season, you would be dive bombed by these birds, this pair of parental birds that nested in this tree year after year after year. And they would basically come down and just dive right into your head, beak first, and like draw blood because you were coming too close to their nest. They were basically a mob of two, but I used to, when mockingbird breeding season arrived, I got in the habit of exiting through these doors, and there were actually some benches over here, and I would oftentimes go and sit on the bench and watch people as they came out these doors and get attacked by these birds, just because it was a little entertaining. So communal defense is one of the reasons to engage in group living. Here's a video that shows this. Oh, it's a mockingbird. Duh. There's a bird attacking a hawk. Everybody's mobbing that bird, and as a result, that bird just is like, finally, it's just not worth it for me to continue to forage here because everybody's aware of my presence, and I'm probably not going to get anything out of the deal anyway. Oh yeah, now you're fine. Actually, I think the rest of this doesn't have to do with group behavior, but just other strategies for avoiding predation. Let me skim through this. Yeah, this is all about feigning injury for the rest of this video. So let's continue to the next thing. So communal defense: mob the predator, get the predator away from your nest in this case, and certainly advertise to other individuals that individual is in the area. If you go down into the southeastern parts of the United States at this point in time, you will, pardon me, you will see herons and egrets that roost in rookeries, where you'll have a bunch of trees around a pond, and in these trees you have literally hundreds of families of herons and egrets laying eggs, forming nests, and things like this. And oftentimes you will see those individuals defending not only their own nest, but defending the nests of other groups through mobbing behavior. We've already talked about vigilance because you guys are writing a paper about vigilance that is due tomorrow. But vigilance is just a matter of being able to avoid predation because you have lots of individuals that are looking out. In Lima and Dill, which is a paper that you guys have read in lab early on in the semester, this was referred to as the many eyes hypothesis. The more eyes you have looking, the less time any individual needs to be looking in order to avoid predation. And as it turns out, the larger the flock, generally the less successful a predator is on, I think this was a flock of pigeons. Yeah, a flock of pigeons. And the reaction distance, the distance between you and the predator when you first react to the predator, goes up, which indicates that in a large flock, you're avoiding predation by detecting the predator at a further and further distance from you as flock size goes up. Similar thing happening, we've already talked about water skimmers, these water bugs that skim around on the surface. They detect the presence of predators by waterborne vibrations because they're being preyed upon by fish. And as you can see, as the number of individuals in the group goes up, the distance from the individual to where the predator is goes up until it finally plateaus, at which point there's no other advantage to being in a larger group because your group is now large enough to detect that predator at a far enough distance away that you can get away from it. Alarm behavior is another thing that organisms in groups engage in. So fish can respond to anti-predator behavior of other fish even when the predator is not in sight. This is a concept called the Trafalgar effect. So are you guys familiar with the Battle of Trafalgar? No, I don't expect you to be. There was a battle, a naval battle that was being fought. I think it was when England was in war with Spain, and Spain had a very effective navy. That's kind of how they rose to power back when Spain was one of the most powerful countries in the world. And so there was a Fort Trafalgar, and they were expecting Fort Trafalgar to be attacked by sea attack from the Spanish Armada. And of course, the Earth is a curved surface, and so there comes a point where you can only see a certain distance out because your eyesight reaches the horizon and you can't see over the hump. And so what the defender of Fort Trafalgar did was he sent boats out. And what these boats did was they basically served as lookouts so that when the Spanish ships were coming, this boat would see that Spanish ship coming, would signal to this boat, which they had eye line with, which would then signal to this boat, which they had eye line with, which would signal to this boat that they had eye line with, which would then signal to the fort. In that way, the people at the fort would know far in advance that this armada was coming towards them, even though that was technically far out of the visual field of the people at the fort. In a similar way, fish can communicate to one another through the water because water carries vibrations, and you can sense a predator being there even though you can't have visual contact with it. This can be done by vibrational cues and also visual cues, but you can also get pheromonal cues. So Synth Cues. A friend of mine in grad school did this experiment as part of a class. He had a group of amphibian larvae with gills in a tank, and then what he had was a set of tubes that brought water down to this tank from another tank up here. And what you do, and there's a water pump that takes water out of this tank and transmits it up to this tank. So this is continuous flow. So there's a tank, a waterfall, and then another tank. And at nighttime, amphibian salamander larvae, in this case, marbled salamanders, they come out to feed, and they're up in the water column. They're feeding on things in the water column. During the daytime, they're down in leaf litter that is at the bottom of the pond that they are in. And so what he did was he shut off the lights, let them emerge from their environment. He had them under red light, And he started the water flowing after they adjusted to the disturbance of water flowing, because these are usually pond inhabiting species. He would either take another salamander and drop it into the tank at the top, at which point the salamander just kind of did its own thing, just kept foraging in the water column. But when he would take out the salamander and put in a fish, this guy, as soon as the water reached him, he could sense the chemicals that were in the water, and he would dive down into the leaf litter to avoid the presence of a predator that the salamander detected simply through chemical cues. In another set of experiments, you could take a salamander and damage it, poke it with something. What happens is the salamander puts off alarm pheromones, dunk that guy into the tank, and as soon as the water reaches here, this guy dives into the leaf litter in the same way that they did as if you would put a fish in here, because in this case, this individual wasn't sensing the chemical signature of the fish. It was actually detecting alarm pheromones of this injured salamander. And so these methods of communication among individuals can be through a variety of sensory modalities. It doesn't have to just be sight. But it's a way of getting long distance information about what's going on in terms of predation. Now, unfortunately, these types of systems are prone to cheating. So we can look at alarm calls in meerkats and alarm calls in prairie dogs and things like this. And I don't think I have a video of this. But in a prairie dog town or a meerkat colony, do they still do meerkat manor? Is that still a thing? You remember it when you were a kid, though. Meerkat manor, they follow this family of meerkats. Well, meerkats live in colonies, and you'll oftentimes see one or two or five meerkats standing up on a tall branch or a big mound or a rock or something, and they're just standing up looking around. And when they see a predator, they will emit an alarm call. And when they do that, everybody runs underground because they don't want to get killed by the predator. And the thing that might happen with these alarm calls is, one way of cheating is to just not pay attention, and that's actually one of the advantages of alarm calls is if everybody else is being vigilant, why should I spend time being vigilant? But the thing that also benefits the alarm caller is that the alarm caller gets first view on the predator, because that's his job, his or her job is to look for the predator. So in theory, they're the safest in a sense. But one of the ways that the alarm caller can cheat is by issuing alarm calls when there isn't a predator around. When you issue the alarm call when there isn't a predator around, everybody goes underground, and guess what you have? You have all the resources that all those other meerkats or prairie dogs or whoever was eating. And so these situations where you live in a group are prone to cheating. But once again, we can model what happens with vigilance per individual, and this is kind of the outcome that we expected to see in your vigilance experiment. As group size increases, vigilance per individual should go down, but what we generally find is it goes down to some plateau, beyond which increasing group size doesn't really gain you anything in terms of vigilance, because there are just so many eyes looking that hardly anybody has to look at any given moment because there are so many eyes. So alarm calls tend to do pretty well in terms of reducing vigilance. This was a playback situation where they either played back white noise or they played sentinel calls to these birds. And when they measured the number of head-up positions, they found that when sentinel calls were being played, that each individual in the group spent less time in vigilance because there was clearly some bird out there exercising vigilance. And for those individuals that were spending less time in the head-up position, they were actually spending more time foraging because their biomass intake increased. And so one of the reasons that you have alarm calls and sentinels is that they are the ones keeping an eye out so that other members of the group can be doing whatever they need to be doing. Now, in order for this to be effective in the long term, you have to shift out who is serving as a sentinel and who is not, because the sentinels eventually have to go and get some food and water and things like that as well. But the advantage of having sentinels is clear from the standpoint of how much time you spend in vigilance, which is hardly any, and you take that time and you spend it in gaining more biomass in this case. So those are a bunch of the benefits of living in a group from the standpoint of avoiding predation. Oh, wait, where is this? Oh, why is group hunting there? Well, anyway, I'm gonna skip order because this next thing, which is about shoaling and guppies, is about predation as well. I don't know why the slides are out of order. So fish occur in schools, and one of the effects of occurring in schools is, once again, to avoid predation. We've talked about this when we talked about schooling before. In Trinidad, there are a series of rivers, and these rivers all flow out of these mountains in the north part of Trinidad into the ocean, and the mountains are fairly steep, and so as the water is flowing down the mountain, there are a series of waterfalls, and these waterfalls tend to filter out large fish species. And so in each of these streams, there are pools and riffles and pools and riffles and pools and riffles until you finally get a big waterfall with a pool at the bottom of it. And then there are pools and riffles and pools and riffles. And then there will be another waterfall. And what happens is small fish live in these small pools up at the top, but they're small enough that they can also migrate up the waterfalls, which larger fish can't. And so oftentimes in downstream reaches of the rivers, you have small fish mixed in with large predatory fish. And so you have the presence of predators in some parts of the stream and the absence of predators in other parts of the stream, even though you may have the same species of small fish in all of these pools. And so they basically transported these guppies. This is a very famous set of rivers in evolutionary biology. They've been studied by a bunch of people for many years. So they transplanted some of these guppies from a predator-rich river to the headwaters of another river. And what they found was that over time they reduced their tendency to school, to form these aggregations. And when these transplanted guppies got washed downstream in rains, as they got to these lower elevation pools that had predators in them, they found that they resumed this shoaling behavior. But what was interesting about this is that they did genetics on this, and what they found was that the individuals that were transplanted, they basically had babies, and as those babies got washed downstream, selection acted to basically select out this individual behavior and reestablish this schooling behavior. And so it ended up being a multi-generational evolutionary response to predation risk. If you take fish from predator-laden streams, put them in streams without predators, they evolve out of that behavior. And then if you take those individuals and put them back into that predator-rich environment, they then re-evolve that tendency to form groups. And so pay attention mainly to this first panel up here. These are downstream, upstream, downstream, upstream into different river systems in Trinidad. And what you find is that the proportion of time that you spend in schooling is higher in the downstream predator-rich environments, and it's lower in the upstream non-predator-rich environments. So those are the advantages from the standpoint of thinking about avoiding predators. So the other set of advantages that we talked about at the beginning of this chapter are advantages that accrue from groups just finding food more efficiently. One example from your book is the effect of lions in group hunting. And as it turns out, cooperative hunting in lions actually helps them take down larger prey. It helps them take down prey that are more efficient. And they basically have evolved a set of behaviors that allow them to hunt in a relatively coordinated manner. And so you can see that there are different positions within this pride of lions. Some individuals are directly attacking the prey. Other individuals are coming up from the sides. And what this is showing is just basically the number of times that individuals have taken up positions in the pride. And what you find is that some individuals tend to take up the more direct attack role, whereas other individuals in the pride tend to take up roles of attacking from one side or the other side. So there are very specific roles within this particular hunting strategy, and they're repeatable within an individual. So each of these graphs is an individual, and it's a frequency histogram of how often they took up position A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. And there's handedness in this, which was an unusual finding. You guys are either right-handed or left-handed. Well, evidently so are lions, right-handed and left-handed. Some individuals tend to attack more from the right-hand side. Other individuals tend to attack more from the left-handed side. The other thing that your book talks about, which I don't have any slides about, so that was about acquiring prey as a member of a group, but there's also the issue of finding prey. And finding prey can be enhanced by living in a group if you live in a group that has kind of a sedentary location. And so this is a hypothesis called the information center hypothesis. So it was put forth by Ward and Zahavi, 1974. This is an idea that really applies well to rat populations. So if you study rat colonies in the wild or in captive environments, what you will see rats doing is you'll see rats coming and going from areas as individuals, but they always come back to a center where all of the rats live. And so a rat will go off, and a rat will come back. Another rat will go off someplace, and a rat will come back. And one of the things that you see rats doing when new rats get back from after being out somewhere is all the rats back at the colony will sniff the breath of that rat. And what they're doing is they're picking up cues as to where that rat has been and what that rat has gotten into. And if that rat has been someplace where that rat has found food, those individuals that are back at the colony will pick up that cue. They will have just seen that rat returning from a particular direction, and when they go out next to forage for food, they will head off in that direction. If they sniff this rat, and this rat does not smell like it got into a food supply. When they leave, they won't follow that rat's path out of the colony. And so the place where you live becomes a center of information because all of these rats are going out into the environment in all kinds of different directions. Some of them are finding food and coming back smelling like food, and you pick up that information when they return to the colony. Other rats don't come into contact with food. They come back without smelling like that, and as a result, once again, that's another piece of information that is used to influence the behavior of those individuals that remain. So, unfortunately, one of the things that I've mentioned before, and if you didn't pick up on it, I'm going to reiterate it again today. Oftentimes, we find that these mathematical models that behavioral ecologists use to predict what behavior should be, oftentimes these models, these optimality models, they have good qualitative fit, but they oftentimes have poor quantitative fit. So for example, where vigilance is concerned, we might have an optimality model that predicts how big of a group you should be in, but even though it predicts that as group size goes up, the amount of vigilance should go down. From a little to a lot. And while it might make this prediction, an optimality model might predict that the optimal group size is this group size. But what we find when we go out and look in nature is that we actually find individuals occupying groups that are larger than the optimal predicted group size. And that's what I mean when I say they have good qualitative fit in that they do the general pattern, but the specifics of what the actual group size should be turn out to be different in nature than what a theoretician would predict just based on kind of running the mathematical model. And so they generally do what we expect them to do, but they don't do exactly what we expect them to do. And in terms of group size, it's almost always skewed towards larger groups. So this is a very consistent thing. Organisms are oftentimes found in larger groups than predicted by theory. And your book goes on at some length to talk about what the reasons are as to why this particular thing happens. And it happens in this particular directional way with group size. What are some of those ideas that your book puts forward? Some of these relate to the limitations of doing quantitative models to begin with. Some of them are more specific. You guys have not read the chapter on group size. You've not read the chapter on group size? Why have you not read the chapter on group size? That's fair. Mason, talk to me about skew. Avery, talk to me about skew. You guys just expect me to come here and deliver you everything? Well, except yes. All right. When you make an optimality model, you're basically predicting what an organism will do in response to something else, right? So when we think about vigilance, we're thinking that the only thing that an individual has to worry about in this case is what? Predation. The whole reason that you're being vigilant is you're looking out for predators. Is that the only thing that an individual has to think about? No, it has to think about eating, which is why there's this trade-off between how much time you spend in vigilance versus how much time you spend with your head down eating. And so this kind of incorporates feeding into the mix. Is predation and feeding the only two things you have to worry about? You have to think about finding a mate. Is finding a mate the only thing that you have to worry about? Once you've mated, you have to engage in parental care. So maybe the reason that individuals exhibit or hang out in larger groups is because vigilance and feeding aren't the only two things that an individual has to worry about. And if you're dividing your time up between predation and feeding and mating and providing parental care, you actually need even less time spent in vigilance, which might make you then hang out in a larger group than would be predicted if all you were thinking about is this trade-off between exercising vigilance and feeding. So that's one reason, is that you're looking at the wrong currency in a sense. When we talk about currencies and models, you're just not looking at the appropriate aspect of the behavior of the organism. A second reason is that an optimal group size might not be stable. So we see this in ideal free distribution kinds of models, where as group size increases, the benefit of being in that group goes down, such that maybe it's most optimal to be at a group size, let's say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe 7 is the optimal group size, but the cost for going off and living by yourself in another habitat might be so low that you actually stay in this group at much higher levels, because you have to wait. Even being the 8th individual in this population is better than being the first individual in this other area. And so what you see is that if you have a group of 7 individuals, so the optimal group size is 7, but even though it's worse to be the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, or 14th individual added to that group that was originally 7, these are all better outcomes than being the first individual in a group all by yourself. This group is going to accumulate individuals until you get to the 15th individual, at which point it's less beneficial to be the 15th individual in a group than it is to be the first individual in a group of 1. And so this is one way in which group size gets larger than optimality theory might predict, because even living in a suboptimally large group might be better than living by yourself. In a similar way, if you get to 8 individuals, your choice is either to be the 8th individual in a group that was 7, or to be 1 individual by yourself, keeping that group at an optimal level of 7. If you then have that individual staying and another individual growing the group, you now have 9 individuals, And so at some point, the value of being in this group declines to the point that now this group splits, and maybe it splits into a group of 5 individuals and 6 individuals. If you're in a group of 5 individuals and 6 individuals in the same environment, is that going to stay that way? If the optimal value is 7, what do you expect to happen? One individual is going to leave this group and go into this group, making that a group of 7 and that a group of 4. Now, in this case, you now have a group that is at the optimal level and a group that is suboptimally low, but you don't have any that are suboptimally high. So one of the things that we see when we actually look at groups is that group size fluctuates a lot. And group size can fluctuate because suboptimally large groups might be better than being in a really suboptimally small group. And also there becomes this sorting as groups split, as groups grow in size. And so skew exists, but it almost always is skew to the large size rather than to the smaller size for these reasons. Questions so far? All right. Group decision making. So when you're in a group, and you have experienced this, I'm guessing, is it easier to make a decision by yourself or is it easier to make a decision in a group? Oh, so much easier by yourself. Why is it so complicated to make a decision as a group, as humans? No one can agree because everybody has their own agendas, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes, you may not even know what the shared goal is. You may actually have different goals. If you have different goals, then your paths for reaching those goals are necessarily going to be different. And so, as humans, we find it difficult to make decisions as groups because we have complicated goals and agendas, and also probably complicated options of directions to go. So one of the things that behavioral ecologists think about when they think about groups, living in groups, is how do organisms that don't have all the complications of humans make decisions in ways that they seem to be self-organizing. And what we find in animal systems is that oftentimes one of the ways in which this works is that animals that are not humans, the non-human animals in the world, actually make decisions using relatively simple decision-making tools or decision rules. So the self-organizing behavior that we see is usually through the application of relatively simple rules. And so one example given in your book is an example having to do with fishes. And we've talked about fish schools and how they tend to move in these kind of coordinated patterns. And one of these patterns is a torus. And a torus is just a situation where all of the fish are kind of moving around in a circle in a particular direction. And you've seen, if you've ever watched a marine nature documentary, you've seen this particular behavior. But fish don't only move around in a torus. They don't simply move around in these schools that kind of stay in relatively one place. You also see fish that are moving unidirectionally as a school. Everybody's heading in one particular direction. They may shift slightly one way or another, but they have this coordinated movement in a particular direction. And then there are other situations in which fish just kind of seem to be randomly moving about. And you will see all three of these patterns in fish schools. What do you think might be the simple decision-making rule that a fish would have that would result in these three seemingly organized behaviors? This is directional movement. This is a torus. This is referred to in literature as a swarm. What kinds of simple behavior, what kind of simple decision rule might result in these three different kinds of patterns? Once again, this is described in your book, but if you didn't read the chapter, you wouldn't know it, but you might be able to think your way through it. So spend a minute thinking your way through it. You are an individual fish. You have a decision to make in terms of how you're going to behave, and your individual behavior influences the behavior of other individuals around you, and that results either in a swarm or a torus or directional movement of the entire group. Seemingly simple behavior leading to this coordinated group behavior. Imagine that you are a fish and another fish comes along and gets right up in your business. What might you want to do? You might want to move away from it. Why? Because this other fish is just too close to you. So you can think about a zone of proximity around the focal fish that if you are within this zone, your tendency is to move away from the neighboring fish. If everybody's doing that, you don't end up with a torus, you don't end up with directional movement, you end up with this kind of random swarm of movement because every fish is encountering another fish that is too close to themselves, and as a result, everybody's just trying to get away from everybody else. Until you're now far enough away from everybody else that what starts to happen? We'll call this zone A. Now, every fish is a little further away from you. You're not worried about the fish being too close, but you're also not worried about your neighboring fish being too far away, right? What's the advantage of being in the group? There's power in numbers. You can avoid predation better when you're in a group. You can find food better when you're in a group. So you don't maybe want your neighbors to be too close to you, but you also don't want your neighbors to be too far away. So if your neighbor fish is this distance away, what you do is you move in a coordinated fashion to stay close to them. If everybody is trying to stay close, but not too close and not too far away, which of these two remaining patterns occurs? A torus occurs because you want to be close to that fish, but you don't want to be too close to that fish, and you don't want to be too far away from that fish. So a torus develops. What happens when fish start spreading out so that your neighbor, so in this case you form a torus, so you have orienting behavior. In this situation, when you have fish that are now moving away from you, they're now getting too far away from you. What do you want to do? You want to get closer to them, and so you move towards other fish. If this fish is getting too far away from you, you move towards that fish. That puts you now further away from this fish. That fish moves towards you, and that's where you get directional movement. Simple decision-making rule. Too close to me, get away. Too far, follow. Just right, stay just right. Three really complicated coordinated, two complicated coordinated movements and one more random assemblage that grow out of a simple decision-making rule that is based on proximity. You will see this at parties. Do you guys go to parties? And do this with Mason because Mason won't be offended by it, perhaps. If you're at a party and somebody's like right up on you, how does that feel, Mason?
Depends if they're a male or female.
Okay.
Usually not good. I'll get my space.
Yeah, you will back away a little bit until you have what you feel like is a comfortable space. What you see at a party oftentimes is you see little clusters of people gathering, and those people are almost always standing the same distance apart from one another, separated by wider gaps between those groups. And it's because we have a certain expectation of kind of social distance, acceptable social distance. Um, you get too close to somebody, that person obviously gets away from you because you're being creepy. And so we have self-organizing behavior at parties, partly because we have, once again, a simple decision-making rule, which is in this case based on proximity. I make Mason uncomfortable when I go and stand right next to him in a classroom. Simple decision-making rules affecting group behavior, leading to what we think of as organized group behavior. Army ants do this when they go to move their nest from one place to another. You can read about that in the book. You guys ever go to the Harriman Jewell series events? I mean, we used to have them. We now have started picking them up again. How do you know where to go? You follow the group. You enter the Kauffman Center, and you may be looking at your ticket, and you may know your way around the Kauffman Center, but chances are you probably don't. You see one or two people you recognize from William Jewell, maybe professors, maybe fellow students. You look and see what direction they're going, and what do? You follow them. Sometimes they lead you down a path that is to the wrong auditorium because they also don't know where they're going. But once again, it's a simple decision-making rule. That person is going someplace. I know that person. I need to go that place also. And then you follow them, and usually it gets you to the right place. Sometimes it doesn't. And so that type of behavior is oftentimes found out in nature as well. Ants do this. Ants are really good at finding food and leading others to that food. And it's often due to this tendency of individuals to follow one another. Voting is another kind of relatively simple decision-making algorithm. Voting, you can think of it as voting like in an election, but it's not really intended for you to think it that way. You guys know about Francis Galton? Have you heard of him in another class? He invented the idea of regression. He was cousin of Charles Darwin and lived back in that day. And Galton did this simple experiment. You guys, you're from Texas originally? No. You're moving to Texas. Where are you from originally?
Overland Park.
Overland Park. You're from?
Wichita.
Wichita. And you're from a small town about an hour from here, right? You guys ever been to a county fair? Did you ever see a guess the weight of the cow or the pig or anything like that contest? Describe that to me, Elizabeth. Yeah, so you pay a price to get a guess, to get a ticket, and on that ticket you write down what you think the weight of the cow or the pig is, and usually at these types of events, the winner gets the cow or the pig or whatever it is. So Galton had this idea. He was English, he went to an English town where they were having one of these events, and after the event was over and they announced the winner and they announced the weight of the cow that was being raffled off, he asked the organizer to give him all of the tickets. And what he did was he collected all the tickets. So there's a cow. It's a very thin cow, so you should guess low. And a bunch of people guessed the weight of the cow. The farmer who was making money, so farmers would do this to make money because if you get enough people to guess the weight of the cow, it exceeds the actual value of the cow, and then you have basically sold your cow for more than it's actually worth. It's brilliant when it works. So the farmer knows that this is a 1,200 pound cow. But there are a bunch of guesses at the weight of the cow, and they're on little slips of paper. Somebody says, "Oh, I think that's a 1,300 pound cow. I think that's a 500 pound cow. I think that's an 1,198 pound cow," etc., etc. After the winner was announced and the weight of the cow was known, Galton gathered up all of the slips that people had guessed, and he took their average. Guess what the average of all of those guesses was? It was right on the money. This is what they mean in animal behavior when they talk about voting. This idea that the consensus of the group, even though each individual might not have the right idea, the group as a whole arrives at the right answer to a particular challenge because each individual kind of puts in their input into the decision making. And there are all kinds of ways in which you can apply this practically. Galton referred to this as regression to the mean, and he ultimately developed the idea of linear regression out of this idea. But there are tons of ways in which you can think about this in practical terms. This is how ants recruit other ants to a new nest site. So when it's time for an ant colony to move its nest to a new site, they have to decide where it's going to go. And what they do is they send out a bunch of ants, and ants look for new places. And what these ants do is when one ant has found another ant, or has found a site that they think will be a good site, they come back to the colony, they communicate through pheromones, "Hey, I found a site." And then they drag that ant out to where they think is a new site. If that ant finds that site appropriate, they go back to the colony, and both of them are now talking to another ant each. So now we have two ants talking to two other ants saying, with pheromones, essentially, "Hey, I got a new site." Take those two ants out to the site. They evaluate the site. If they think it's a good site, now you have four ants back at the colony. And as this happens, you get more and more ants coming back to the colony saying to other ants that this is a good site. Other ants are coming back from other places saying, "Oh yeah, I found a good site also." But when they take ants out there, those ants say, "Yeah, that's not such a good site." And when they come back, they don't recruit anybody to go with them to that site. And over time, you get this consensus that everybody kind of agrees through consensus this is where the nest needs to go. And so this process is tandem running, where one ant is following another ant because this ant has told this ant, "Hey, I've got a good idea." This ant is like, "Okay, I'll follow you, but I'm not bought into this yet." Goes and sees the site. And so there comes a lot of tandem running back and forth. And once you get enough tandem running going on, ants going out to a site saying that's an okay site, coming back and recruiting other ants, then all of a sudden the colony shifts from doing tandem running to all of these different places that they're tandem running to, and they all shift to unidirectional transport. And that's when the colony has kind of voted on where to move the new site to. And so once again, it's a form of voting, essentially. Do you see anything like this in human societies? Has been paying attention to the news the last couple of days? No? What big, huge thing is going on? There's wall-to-wall coverage on NPR and some television stations of this. No, it's American. You guys know who Stephen Breyer is? Stephen Breyer, anyone? Did not invent Breyer's ice cream. Supreme Court Justice announced that he was retiring at the end of this session what's happening right now in the Senate. They're doing confirmation hearings for the new Supreme Court justice. In that process, what you have is a bunch of senators making pointless speeches, essentially, and asking the candidate a bunch of questions. But also what's going on in that process is senators are going around to one another, and senators who want that particular particular candidate to be approved and confirmed to the Supreme Court, they're going around to people who aren't convinced yet and trying to convince them that that's the right choice for the Supreme Court. In the same way that ants are coming back from a nest site saying, hey, I've got a good nest site for you, come see it, and if you like it, come back and grab somebody else and take them out to it. So this idea can be in relatively simple terms in things like ants, but also can be kind of relatively simple in human societies. If you've ever run for a particular office in something like a fraternity or a sorority, something like that, what do? Well, you go around to individuals, you try and get them onto your side so that when it comes time to make a decision, they vote in your direction. And in this case, it's voting on a new nest site. In human cases, it's voting for things like offices and positions. But you're recruiting individuals to your particular option. Lots of options of where to take your new nest. The nest that you choose goes to where the most ants vote. That's it for living in groups. Read the next chapter in the textbook between now and Friday.